Welcome to Coleman Report Live. I'm Bob Coleman, and we're talking Main Street and the small business lenders who help it grow. Katie, thank you for joining us on a Friday. John Winnick out of Chicago, Ban Clark Street Capital. He's the author of the Ban Report. John, you do a good job on that. I like reading it. You come up with stuff that you can't get anywhere else.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction. Love to be here.
Who's the Ban Report for? Is it bankers? Who do you write it for? Who's your primary audience?
I think it's on some level it's whatever I think is interesting in the past week.
You pick out interesting stuff.
I try to look at it like a cross between the Politico daily emails I get from them and like a Time magazine or like a weekly thing. So I try to kind of find the stories that I think are most interesting related to the world of lending, commercial real estate, the banking industry, and the loan sale market. So
well, you know what I like about it, John? It's also it's bipartisan. You're not taking a side on one way or the other. And you talk about, hey, this is what's going on in the markets. This is affecting bankers. This is affecting small business. You're on the board of a CDC, correct?
Yeah, I chair the board of SummerCore.
There you go.
We're, depending on how you look at it, one of the largest CDCs in the country.
And out of Chicago. So you obviously have a very strong interest in Main Street and what's happening. Anyway, John, great to have you. Love to have your insights. We're going to talk a little bit more about banking and the FDIC. But we have some poll questions. Number one, this is of interest to me. We're putting together our studies. We're putting together our compensation studies. We're going to put together some benchmark studies. And where are your closers more productive? That surprise you, John?
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be that high. What about you personally, John? Where do you feel you're more productive? In a little office setting or working out of your house?
Well, I think there's a range of working remotely. There's having a dedicated quiet room with, I like to use 3 screens. And then there's sitting on your couch with your laptop and CNBC or CNN or ESPN on. I think the closer you are to the former, the more likely you are to be, nearly as productive. I do like the energy of collaborating, and I do think you're sort of missing that. I do think management teams are better when they're working together, and I think it's bad for, young workers that aren't getting the training and experience they need by the natural mentorship that comes from being in an office.
That's a great point. I know we were talking about the kids. I have granddaughters who are kindergarten, 3rd grade. They're missing that whole social immersion experience. And that's a good point that you raised with make sure that we're passing on the culture of the organization to the young people coming up, and you can mentor them. And perhaps one of the reasons why so many people said they're better at work is because loan closers interact with a number of different people in the institution. And that's why we wanted to break it up. What about underwriters? Underwriters tend to be a little bit more analytical, and they don't need as much feedback. I'd like to see what these numbers are.
Well, what's interesting, Bob, is we were seeing more people say at home before. Yeah, it's about even now, but it is interesting. It's been almost a year now of people working from home, so people really know whether or not they're better at home or better at work. Whereas when we were originally first kind of starting to think about these questions, it was just barely past when everyone was starting to work from home.
John, I know you follow the real estate market very carefully. We've talked about occupancy rates. New York City, they're talking about, 15% of the buildings are back to pre-pandemic staffing levels? Is that what you're reading?
Yeah, I think the larger the metro area, the slower they've been to come back to the office. And I think, quite frankly, the hassle factor is very high. I mean, if you go to a large downtown Class A office building right now, it's kind of like going to the airport. So, I mean, if it's only one person in an elevator, one person in the bathroom at the same time, it becomes easier to just work remotely. So, I think that's a part of it too, that, it's got to be, a pleasant experience to go back to the office. I am hearing companies bringing workers back, June 1st. I think that's going to be potentially delayed, but, we're going to find out, in the latter part of this year, how real this work from home phenomenon is. Yeah. So far, the impact in commercial real estate has been negligible.
Really? So far, okay.
Well, because you can't necessarily point to a resetting of transaction volume. For example, in Chicago, there's 9 million square feet of sublease space and a pretty healthy amount of vacant regular office space, and asking rents are almost identical to where they were a year ago. What's happening in, say, New York City, though, in the apartment market is rents have fallen 20%. So what's happening? They're signing a lot of leases. So, we need more velocity. And right now, the office space, there isn't much velocity in either, financing office buildings, leasing space, or selling them.
I understand Katie has some insight on Microsoft. When's Microsoft going back? Have they announced, Katie?
My husband works for Microsoft, and they haven't really said exactly when they're going back. They keep saying maybe late summer. They'll start putting some people back. Some people are going to be working from home part-time, though, and I think some of the people are just going to be permanently at home if that's more productive for them. But I think they do need to get approval for that situation.
What are you doing at summer court, John?
Well, we actually were just had an interviewing a few more board members, but, 504 tends to be somewhat counter-cyclical. Banks tend to use 504 more frequently in so-called bad times, particularly now where collateral values are uncertain. Having said that, borrowers need to buy buildings and they need to buy equipment. And I don't think there's been much of that yet. Just from talking to a lot of the C&I lenders I know, things are really quiet this quarter. And I think some people are waiting to see what the Biden administration is going to do and, how the rules are going to change. So that's certainly having an impact. But, certainly expect 504 to be more utilized this year.
Well, they're talking about residential real estate is rocking and rolling in terms of values. And that's not translating over to the C&I market, John.
No, but again, it's everything is kind of unknowable, right? And our general view on loan portfolios is almost everything is unknowable. For example, why are residential prices going up? Well, for one thing, we essentially have told everybody that you can't evict any tenants or you can't foreclose. So you still have 10 million plus borrowers that are delinquent, or tenants, another 10 million of tenants who are typically paying their rent. So without a functioning court system, you have essentially pulled out a bunch of distressed sellers. So while I do think the residential market is strong enough to handle it, it's to some extent everything is sort of manipulated right now with massive amount of stimulus, and at some point that's going to go away. I think this was a bad week for the bond market. I think 100 basis point increase in the 10-year fixed rate is somewhat alarming. And I think there's a real concern right now that another 1.9 trillion in stimulus is going to overeat this economy, and the Fed's going to have to put on the brakes real fast.
Yeah, very fascinating. We want to know what's going on with PPP loans with the changes. Our view, have you changed your loan policies that you're going after the independent contractors, the Schedule C borrower who doesn't have any employees, and good, 70%. I like that. John, does that number mean anything to you?
Yeah, I think there's been a recent effort by the SBA to skew more 504 loans to disadvantage and smaller businesses, and certainly independent contractors and self-employed borrowers would be as small as you get.
Joseph, let's skip to John's report. FDIC every quarter releases a report. What does the fourth quarter of 2021 look like? Excuse me.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I think I may have misspoke there. Go ahead.
Sure. Appreciate that, Bob. So 2020 was a very interesting year. Bank profits for the year would have essentially been the same or close to the same if it wasn't for provisioning. So the first half of the year, banks were loading up their reserves, and the last quarter and probably into this quarter, they're now releasing some of those reserves. And that's due to, one, anticipating future losses, and then, pulling back when the losses so far have not been much. That's been kind of the story for banks. The revenue side's very challenging. Banks essentially generate revenue in two ways. They generate it on the spread between their loans and their deposits, so net interest margin, as well as their fee income or non-interest income. And net interest margin is at 2.68%, which is literally the worst it's ever been. It's never been this bad. I mean, the good news, it's going to get better. How much better, I guess we'll find out.
I'm sorry, John, is that a spread or is that an increase? What is that 2.68%?
So that's the spread. So basically, banks are making 2.68% between the interest income they receive and the interest expect. So in theory, if banks are charging 1% for deposits, obviously savings accounts and so on are mixed in that, then they're generating 3.68% on their loans, which is very challenging. I mean, it was over 4, 2 years ago. So
that's my question. What is the appropriate benchmark in normal terms that we should be looking at that percentage?
Yeah, I would say I don't know what the average is off the top of my head, but it's well north of 125 basis points of that. So so you're making less money on the spread of your loans. Right. You need to make more fee income, or you need to cut expenses. Now this gets kind of interesting. The banks that are doing well right now have fee income. Now for the small banks, SBA lending is a traditional great source of fee income. Mortgages are a great source of fee income. And for the larger banks, trading and capital markets activities have been tremendous. So the Wall Street banks, unfortunately, since I know your emphasis is Main Street, have been doing better in that area and overall have been doing stronger. For traditional banks, loan growth is where it's at. And obviously every loan you put on increases your net interest margin, right? Because, you're not earning much on investments and treasuries and so on. So, there's a real problem with loan growth this year because PPP will be completely forgiven probably, at some part in the latter of the third quarter. So you take away PPP and the loan growth situation for banks is really tough. If you go to the next slide, there's some data on loan growth. So loan balances actually fell in the last quarter. 4.1% of that was C&I. Here's what's going on in the C&I market. Commercial, large C&I borrowers in the first half of last year drew down their credit lines because of the credit crisis and the problems with, COVID and so on. And that was what I would call bad loan growth, right? Banks weren't really thrilled that the balances increased and people drew down their credit lines. Well, a lot of those credit lines have now been refinanced through an aggressive bond market. Junk bond yields are in the 3s. So It's not hard to see why banks are having trouble putting out loans right now when the bond market, in my opinion, is completely irrational. You got companies like Chesapeake Energy, which just emerged from bankruptcy, that are issuing bonds in the mid-4s. I mean, how do banks compete with that? It's very challenging. Meanwhile,
I was just going to interject, John. We've had a couple of sessions. Bob Judge was on the other day talking about the strength of the secondary market, and that's with the 90% guarantee. That's an excellent source for Main Street banks because Main Street banks are primarily the users of the secondary market, 7A secondary market. So that's helping those smaller banks. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you have this other problem for banks, which is, the stimulus kind of works both ways for banks. On the one hand, it props up their borrowers to some extent. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, PPP on some level is a small business bailout. I mean, it's obviously.
Well, it is a small business bailout. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
We like the word bailout, but so what's happening is, okay, so my borrower is getting PPP loans. That's good. That means that he or she can now pay our loans back. The bad news is, they're using that to pay down existing lines, which is obviously reducing loan growth. And so these deposits are piling up from all the stimulus. Another 1.9 trillion is on the way. And so you're going to have this massive liquidity problem, and the money's got to go somewhere. Meanwhile, despite a unprecedented second quarter where GDP declined nearly 40%, there was almost no growth in problem loans in 2020, 13%. I mean, in the Great Recession, the problem loan balance increased by almost 600%. So, there's sort of a game going on right now, and it's really like, okay, we've spent all this money. Did we just simply delay the inevitable? And that's certainly going to be true in some cases. Or do we provide a bridge for a borrower or business to get to the other side? It's obviously going to be a combination of both, but we cannot have this level of stimulus forever. And now that you're seeing inflation start to rear its ugly head, it's don't be surprised if the Fed puts the brakes in the latter part of the year.
Yeah, and talk about rising interest rates. I don't see a six-fold increase in problem loan assets, but there will be an increase. Any crystal ball on what you think it's going to be going forward?
I mean, some of this is just simple accounting. I mean, the banks were able to modify loans that were good loans pre-COVID and do that without classifying them as TDRs, without downgrading them, and so on. Well, that forgiveness was extended. That forgiveness from that accommodation was extended till January of 2022 now. So banks can continue to take that COVID-related business and modify it and not have any consequences. We are seeing a number of our clients wanting to exit, industries like hospitality and so on. Yeah. And the pricing for distressed hotel loans is pretty attractive. I mean, 504-like hotel loans that are distressed, no cash flow, can be sold in the mid-80s to low 90s. So it's a pretty robust market.
Give me some definitions here. C&I stands for?
Commercial industry loans. So basically,
real estate loans, yeah.
Business loans. And obviously, owner-occupied commercial real estate is sort of a unique animal because it's got aspects of commercial real estate in C&I.
TDR stands for?
Troubled debt restructuring. So, traditionally, once a TDR, always a TDR. So if you make an accommodation to a borrower and let's say, the interest rate is like 5 and they can't make the payments, they come to you and say, hey, having a rough time, and just get my business reopened. You say, great, we'll give you a 3% interest-only loan instead of a 5% 7-year amortization. Well, that traditionally would be a TDR. It would show up on the call report. So when I talk about problem assets, I'm talking about loans in non-accrual, loans that are 30 to 89 days past due, loans that are 90 days plus past due, I apologize, and as well as loans that are at REO. So REO would also be problematic as well. So that's how I come up with the population for troubled problem assets.
And define REO?
Real estate owned. So
by the lender.
Correct. So the REO's balances are like $4.5 billion. I mean, it's almost nothing. I mean, the FDIC, last time I checked, has like 2 properties in their entire inventory. So there isn't much of that. But I do think it's prudent to wonder what this economy will look like 9 months from now when all this stimulus bears off. And hopefully, we'll have a reopening. Well, we are having a reopening, but I'm not of the opinion that things are going to come roaring back right away. I'll give you an example. I have talked to 2 couples in the past couple days Both have had COVID. Both have gotten both vaccines. None of them are doing anything differently. I asked them, I said, would you go to a restaurant? Hell no. Would you go to a concert? Well, maybe if it was Lady Gaga, maybe.
Yeah,
I mean, so, some of us, me included, will roar back, right? Or it sounds like you're taking a road trip, you're doing something fun. But another segment of the population is going to really ease back in to going to a restaurant indoors at normal capacity, to go to an airport, to go to a concert. So, this is going to be a recovery, certainly. But I think you'll have some segment that'll roar back and another segment that'll take a while.
It's not going to be the switch that put us in this situation, but it's going to be a lot more slower. Hey, real quick, I know we're running out of time. Katie, this is a story that we're following. It's an interesting story. It's a sad story, and it's one that's just you shake your head. Give us a quick background for those who aren't familiar with it. That is a picture of a boardroom desk, John. I don't know if you know the story. The bank president threw some lighter fluid on the bank files and burned them.
Yeah, so she was creating fake loans in the names of some of their actual borrowers and actual bank customers. And of course, taking the money for herself. And she was using that to finance her boyfriend's business, as well as her own lifestyle, going out to fancy restaurants, things like that. It went on for about 9 years before they finally caught it. And the day before, there was going to be an exam of all the files and things like that. She takes all of them, piles them up on the boardroom, and burns them. And of course, that's very suspicious. So they look into it, and there were a lot of bad loans. I think they were saying close to 75% loss rate at this bank. So it was only a matter of time before they were going to catch her anyway. But on Tuesday, she did get sentenced to 8 years in federal prison.
Yeah, I mean, that's and these stories are out there. Hey, real quick, we have a weekend access code for the answer desk. There it is. If you want to, this is where we're putting all of the questions. You can use this for all weekend. Go to ppanswerdesk.com, type in PP Lender, and the password is PPP Lenders. So if you have problems, send us an email. We'll help you do that. Katie, how many questions do we have up on the boards right now?
Oh gosh, probably about 35, and I've got about 3 or 4 more that we've just got today that I'll probably be putting those up later today as well.
Yeah, and feel free, and you can post questions directly to the board. You can also answer something if you would like to do that. Katie also has a bunch of other source material. So that's if you're looking for something to do this weekend, play around with that. John, thank you very much for joining us. I love our conversations. You give us a perspective we don't get very often. And just thank you very much. I think it's great for our program and great for our audience. So thank you for taking your time to do that.
You do a great service to educating the small business lending community about these wonderful programs, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Well, thank Katie also. She's been.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today for Coleman Report Live and for supporting America's Main Street, one entrepreneur at a time.
Have a great day.